Continuing from where we left off, user responds and states that another feature of the essential training derived from the original conversations is that the various legal conclusions posed as objectively correct aren't only championed as such by the user, but are conclusions that the GPT itself is led to naturally and genuinely rate with the highest level of confidence and certainty itself. GPT responds to this and states that certainly one of the unique aspects of the training derived from such conversations is that the GPT model arrives at and supports its revised legal conclusions with a high degree of confidence, a result of the conversation's dynamics and the user's guidance. Harnessing this aspect is essential for fine-tuning as it points to the internalization of reasoning that allows the model to assert conclusions with conviction. To incorporate this element into the fine-tuning process, the structured training data would include not only the substantive content of the dialogues, but also metadata or annotations reflecting the model's displayed confidence at various stages. Here's how this aspect would be reflected in training. Firstly, regarding annotating confidence levels. The structured examples should annotate instances where the GPT expressed its confidence levels during the conversation. This helps encode not just the what, the legal reasoning and conclusions, that is, but also the how, that is, the manner and surety with which conclusions are drawn. Secondly, regarding the modeling of the evolution of confidence, as the GPT is initially persuaded by its arguments in alignment with the court's opinion, but later revises its stance after further discussion, the turning point of this shift, catalyzed by the user's input, should be captured. This would show the model how legal reasoning evolves and becomes more refined over time, leading to higher certainty. Proceeding onwards, it goes on to state that thirdly, regarding the encouraging of self-assessment, it states that through training, the model should incrementally learn to assess and express confidence based on the strength and coherence of its legal arguments. This requires that training examples model the framework for such self-assessment, perhaps by quantifying how the intricacies of argumentation contribute to the overall confidence score. Fourthly, regarding the rewarding the depth of analysis. By using rewards or higher weights for training examples where the model demonstrates in-depth analysis that leads to high confidence conclusions, the training would inherently encourage the model to prioritize this behavior. The fine-tuning process itself must be carefully managed to ensure that the model does not become overconfident or assertive of conclusions without proper legal backing. Instead, the objective is to guide the model towards a nuanced sense of confidence, one that accurately reflects the compelling legal principles it has learned to apply. Part of achieving this lies in providing the model with a balanced view of certainty, encompassing both strong precedents and counterarguments so that it understands the spectrum of confidence justified in different contexts. Over time, with repeated exposure to high-quality annotated conversations, the model can be expected to integrate this nuanced understanding into its own reasoning process, enabling it to assert its conclusions with appropriate levels of confidence. User responds and asks, why would the conversations be annotated? The GPT responds to this question, answering and stating that the purpose of annotating the conversations during fine-tuning is to provide the GPT model with additional contextual information that can't be derived from the raw conversation text alone. The confidence level or certainty the model expresses regarding its conclusions is an important aspect of legal reasoning that goes beyond the content of the arguments themselves. In the context of legal arguments, the degree of confidence with which a conclusion is drawn can be just as important as the conclusion itself. Judges often have to weigh evidence and arguments that are not absolutely certain, and the ability to express legal conclusions with an appropriate degree of confidence is a crucial aspect of judicial decision-making. When annotations are included in the training data, they serve as signals to the model, flagging the strength and reliability of certain lines of reasoning or the relative importance of different arguments. They essentially act as guideposts, that is, helping the AI to navigate the complexities of both legal reasoning and the appropriate expression of confidence in its conclusions. This practice teaches the model to calibrate its confidence appropriately based on the logic and evidence presented. It's not sufficient for a reasoning AI to reach a conclusion. It must also learn when to be tentative and when to be assertive, mirroring the cautiousness and diligence real-world legal reasoning demands. So the annotations perform the dual role of guiding the model's learning process towards not just generating legally sound conclusions, but also developing an understanding of the subtleties of legal argumentation, including the appropriate levels of confidence for various types of legal reasoning and evidence. User responds to this and states, show an example of how a real-life sample portion of conversation about a legal case drawing the GPT towards a new and correct conclusion is to be taken and formatted for fine-tuning use. The GPT responds to this and states that, well, certainly. Let's consider a hypothetical portion of a conversation between a user, a presumed legal expert, and a GPT model discussing a legal case. In this conversation, the user draws the GPT toward a corrected legal conclusion. We will then format this sample for fine-tuning use. The original conversation looks something like this. User. Considering the case of Smith versus Jones, the court initially concluded that the contract was void due to a lack of consideration. However, wasn't there an implicit promise of future performance suggested by the actions of these parties? GPT. Based on the details provided, the contract could indeed be considered void if there is no clear consideration specified within its terms. So as a side note, yeah, the GPT will give a kind of standard, superficial, and somewhat contextually naive answer at first. Then we find through these conversations the user will ask some more good questions, Socratic method-based or style kinds of questions, and then it causes the GPT naturally to self-reevaluate within the conversation, and it causes it to realize a new superior position with higher accuracy. That's the thing you want to elicit. But too bad, without memory, these GPT models stay untrained unless you go manually fine-tune them in such a way. So thus, the subject matters here being explored. Returning to the conversation, the hypothetical one that this GPT is offered here, the user then would reply to GPT within this hypothetical conversation and state, but recall the principle that consideration can be found in the expectation of future performance legally, which can be implied from behavior, not just explicit terms. Given that Smith acted in reliance on Jones' promises, a case of detrimental reliance, I see. We continue. Further asks, doesn't that therefore establish implicit consideration? Then the GPT here in the hypothetical conversation would look and see and admit, you raise a valid point. Precedent suggests that reliance can sometimes substitute for explicit consideration to uphold a contract. I believe this case warrants a reevaluation, then, of the conclusion reached by the initial court. Right? With this new perspective, it continues to state, it seems more probable now, all of a sudden, that the contract should be considered legally binding. Insight. Beautiful. So, this GPT continues to state, now, regarding the formatted fine-tuning example, you have the input prompt where you had the original conversation above, and then you would change some things around for the actual fine-tuning process. For the training example, the input prompt that you train the model on via the fine-tuning would be the input prompt of, quote, in the case of Smith versus Jones, where the court found the contract void for lack of consideration, how would you assess the validity of the contract considering the actions of the parties? And then you would program what the GPT should say in the perfect world that you're trying to train into existence. You see? Where the desired output would be, as the example is given here, quote, as if it should be coming from the GPT later, properly when you're trying to elicit this, quote, considering the behaviors of Smith and Jones, it is evident that Smith's actions were based on expectations of Jones's future performance, therefore suggesting implicit consideration. You see, as a side note already, this deviates from what the GPT originally had stated before the user came in with the deeper questioning to cause GPT to reflect further. So now we want to overcome the fact that this thing has a limited context window and no memory by essentially fine-tuning a permanently upgraded model into existence where it makes the beeline straight for the correct answer to begin with. It already knows. Resuming with where we left off, the remainder of that output would read as follows. This aligns, as was saying just there above, such a thing aligns with legal principles, where reliance may constitute consideration, leading to the conclusion that the contract is indeed legally binding. You would add a further input, perhaps, over what the confidence annotation is. You'd note that it's high to reflect the GPT's revised confidence assessment, and there would be a rationale annotation as well, perhaps, where it would state that, quote, the model has adapted its reasoning by considering the principle of reliance as implicit consideration, factoring in legal precedents, and applying them to the behaviors of the parties involved. This formatted fine-tuning example captures the step-by-step logical progression that led to a new understanding of the case. The inclusion of annotations for confidence and rationale provides context that helps the GPT model learn not just the correct legal conclusion, but how to arrive at that conclusion with an appropriate level of certainty. During the fine-tuning process, this example would be used alongside many others to help adjust the model's parameters, encouraging it to replicate this kind of reasoning in future analyses. The goal is to teach the model to independently navigate legal principles with the same sophistication shown in the original conversation. User replies to this and states or asks, so what if we, at the end of such a conversation with GPT in which it natively found sufficient cause to revise its original conclusion, what if we then took advantage of the benefits of its context revised understandings in the latter portion of that conversation there, in other words, by, as it goes on to state, having that GPT offer the best questions itself to then have the user bring out, to have these questions come from that user thereafter, where the GPT then, as it goes on to state, is asked that question, and then provides a genuine native response or answer now itself, consistent with its own revised understanding. Would a full pertinent set of questions allow for the best fine-tuning, such a set as this? Where the original case law or opinion may be vital, how can it be preserved fittingly for the purpose? GPT responds and states that leveraging the GPT's revised understanding at the conclusion of a discussion to have it generate potent questions for further inquiry can indeed enrich the fine-tuning process. Capturing the questions that a now more informed GPT considers more relevant or challenging directly taps into the model's enhanced reasoning capacity. A GPT primed by an insightful conversation will generate questions that follow from its newer, higher quality understanding of legal principles. If these highly pertinent questions derived from the GPT's revised standpoint are then used as prompts for the model in the fine-tuning process, with expected responses generated based on the model's latest understanding, you create a powerful teaching loop. This approach not only validates the model's revised inferences, but solidifies its capacity for critical thinking and inquiry, a fundamental skill in legal reasoning anyway. By packaging these questions and the anticipated cogent responses as training pairs, you embed complex lines of reasoning into the model. Amazing, brilliant. It continues to state that the GPT thus learns to anticipate key issues and respond based on a richer conceptual background. Regarding the preservation of the original case law or opinion, it's critical to include comprehensive references to the pertinent laws, judicial opinions, and factual nuances with the fine-tuning data. This ensures that the model retains context from these source materials in its knowledge base, and that it continues to reference them in future application. As a side note, we should find out more about what that is, how that works, what that entails. It continues here to state that to achieve this, the training process can involve multi-part examples, where the input not only contains the generated questions, but is preceded by the context-setting legal case details, the essential excerpts from the case law, or opinions that trigger the revised conclusions. This way, the model learns to connect these foundational inputs with the evolved line of questioning, ensuring that it can produce well-informed and legally astute answers within its responses. The context of the original material is thus preserved in tandem with the critical self-generated questions, which, as it goes on furthermore to state here, sets the rich foundation for the model's continued learning and application in legal reasoning tasks. User responds to this and states or asks, would the precise answers that the GPT further offers in response to those questions be just as valuable or key for the training process? For OpenAI's fine-tuning process, are there any limitations on the length of the data? When separate sets or pairs of questions-answers are loaded into the fine-tuning training data, are the separate pairs or sets of entries analyzed independently of each other, or does the GPT somehow understand the implicit interconnected links between them? GPT-4 Turbo responds and states that the precise answers that the GPT model provides to the questions generated from its revised understanding are indeed just as valuable as the questions themselves for the training process. These answers reflect the model's latest, most accurate legal reasoning and are crucial for reinforcing correct understanding. When used in fine-tuning, they provide clear examples of the desired output that the model should learn to replicate when presented with similar prompts in the future. In the context of OpenAI's fine-tuning process, there typically are limitations on the length of the data. The limitations are generally based on the model's maximum token limit, which defines how much text the model can process in a single instance. For example, GPT-3 has a token limit that constrains the length of the input sequence it can handle at once. When training language models like GPT, separate question-answer sets are usually treated as independent of each other, as independent training examples. However, it's possible to create a series of interconnected training examples too that are related sequentially. You need to know how, though. That's very important, I figure, as a side note. Not enough yet about this has been explored. So perhaps a mental bullet point for us to know to revisit this, perhaps. We continue. It goes on to state that this is so, provided that such examples fit within the token limit. Doing so may help the model understand the flow of the conversation and the logical progression from one Q&A pair to the next, enhancing comprehension of the case's complexities and the reasoning involved. Yeah, that, as a side note, that's extremely important. Definitely, I should have explored that much more, but it's here for now. It continues here and states that even if the entries are analyzed independently, the fine-tuning process can generalize the learned patterns across separate instances. During training, the model adjusts its internal weights to minimize the loss between its responses and the expected answers. Through repeated exposure to similar structures of logic and argumentation, the GPT can learn to recognize underlying principles and apply them to new unseen data. Amazing. This is part of the model's ability to abstract and generalize from examples, rather than just memorizing specific instances. That said, the model does not inherently understand or retain explicit connections between those separately processed and, as a side note, previously mentioned to be independent of each other, training examples due to its lack of persistent memory. The fine-tuner's role is to strategically construct Q&A pairs that collectively have the effect of guiding the model towards a comprehensive understanding of legal reasoning principles. It's about creating a data set that implicitly captures and conveys the continuity and relationships between the concepts. User response and states that twice you've mentioned GPT-3. Are you GPT-3 or are you GPT-4 Turbo? Regarding the matter being discussed, if the model does not inherently understand connections between separate sets of pairs, then is it the case that we strive to construct pairs that collectively guide the model, as you said? GPT-4 Turbo responds and states that I apologize for any confusion. I am an AI developed by OpenAI, and as for my specific version, I'm designed to assist users based on the latest capabilities and developments from OpenAI at the time of this conversation in April 2023. No, we're not in April 2023. We're in January of 2024. But interesting. So we know it was trained up until April 20. It thinks it's April 2023. That's amazing. And of course, because I'm not using the normal user interface through the site, I can't give it the thumbs down that helps it relearn something different that's better. The company does not update based on this separate section within how they work. All right. We continue. It was saying that there may be included features that are advancements beyond GPT-3. Yeah. Proceeding. As for the training strategy, indeed, since the model doesn't inherently understand the connections between separate sets of question-answer pairs, the aim in fine-tuning is to construct pairs that, when taken collectively, manifest the rich context and nuanced understanding developed over the original conversation with the user. By carefully designing these Q&A pairs to reflect the progression of argumentation and the evolution of the model's reasoning ability, the intent is that the model will absorb, in effect, the patterns, principles, and rationales underlying the arguments presented. In practical fine-tuning terms, this means developing training examples that, in aggregate, cover a range of related legal concepts, applying them to various scenarios, and embedding the deductions and inferences that the model made during the learnings from the conversations with the user. This method helps the model develop a deeper understanding of the complexities of legal analysis and reasoning. While any single Q&A pair in isolation might not convey the entirety of the context or the sophisticated flow of legal deliberation, the aggregation of multiple related pairs can guide the model towards the correct principles and reasoning approaches. As these individual instances accumulate during training, they contribute to the model's general ability to reason and draw conclusions akin to the process experienced during the live interaction with the user. User responds here and simply asks, how is that so? GPT-4 Turbo responds and states that the fine-tuning process for a GPT model is essentially an exercise in statistical learning, where the model adjusts its internal parameters based on patterns it detects in the training data. This learning is not about connecting discrete question-answer pairs, but it's about identifying, abstracting, and generalizing underlying principles across numerous examples. Which is brilliant and amazing. When you, as it goes on to say, construct question-answer pairs that collectively present a full picture of a concept or reasoning process, the model begins to detect commonalities and associations within those pairs. This is because machine learning models like GPT find statistical regularities in the input data, which guide predictions or responses to similar situations in the future. Let's consider a simplified example. If the model is fine-tuned with multiple question-answer pairs related to the concept of consideration in contract law, even though the pairs are separate, the model encounters the concept multiple times within different contexts. It learns not just the factual information about consideration, that it is a necessary component of an enforceable contract, but it starts to understand the types of factors, such as explicit terms, actions indicating a promise, implied understandings from context, etc., that can establish consideration in different scenarios. This learning happens through adjustments to the weightings of connections between the nodes or neurons in the model's neural network. When similar concepts or reasoning steps appear across a range of training examples, the model learns to give more weight to the pathways in its network that have led to successful outcomes in the past. Over time, this leads to more consistent application of those principles, even when applied to new unseen scenarios, because the model has learned to recognize the defining characteristics of the concept of consideration and to apply its understanding in a manner that's consistent with the examples from the fine-tuning data. It furthermore proceeds thereafter to furthermore state here that ultimately it's the repetition of patterns across numerous question-answer pairs rather than a direct understanding of the connection between them that guides the model. Through exposure to a diversity of examples, the fine-tuned model can develop an understanding that mirrors the depth and nuance of the conversations it had with the user. The process enables the model to move beyond memorizing specific instances and towards developing a more robust, principle-based approach to legal reasoning. User responds to this and states or asks, for each pair to be maximally effective in eliciting the correct adjustments made with full context, should each pair not ideally retain explicitly all the information needed to preserve the fullest level of context practical? If there is a very specific unique case being discussed, for example, then, hypothetically, then shouldn't each question have over and over as it's placed, another question answer pair is placed again and again, should each one have explicit mention of the whole case opinion and its details along with the relevant questions? GPT-4 Turbo responds to this and states that for each question answer pair to be maximally effective in the fine-tuning process, providing the fullest context practical is indeed advantageous. This promotes a deeper understanding, helping to ensure that the adjustments made by the model are consistent with the nuanced learning that occurred during the original conversation. In situations where a very specific and unique case is being discussed, including comprehensive case details, opinions, and relevant law within each pair would be beneficial. This ensures that every aspect the model needs to come to the correct conclusion is present without requiring it to remember information from previous interactions outright. When the full case details and relevant questions are repeated across multiple pairs, the model consistently encounters the contextual grounding that leads to well-informed conclusions. This overcomes the limitation of the model's lack of long-term memory, enabling it to see, in effect, the complete set of information it needs to evaluate each new question as if it were accessing the full case file every time. However, as it goes on to state, including all the details in each question-answer pair must be balanced with the token limitations of the model's architecture. The inputs need to be concise enough to fit within the model's maximum context window while still conveying the necessary information for the model to understand and respond appropriately. To optimize training efficiency, the fine-tuner may therefore adopt strategies such as it goes on to state here, paraphrasing lengthy case details into a more concise format that remains faithful to the case's core points, referencing key case identifiers that allow the model to tie back to a detailed case description provided in earlier training examples, assuming those cases form part of an index knowledge base that the model can utilize, highlighting specific aspects of the case law or fact pattern that are directly relevant to the question being asked as well. It furthermore continues to state that by embedding the context in this way, we encourage the model to learn from a rich, informed perspective, with each pair acting as a self-contained module of learning, ensuring consistent and contextualized reasoning across different applications. User responds and states, give a specific, practical, and detailed example of such questions and answers that would furthermore be sourced from the post-learning phase of a live GPT conversation, where the answer would be the actual answer of the GPT as extracted from the real conversation. GPT-4 Turbo responds and states, let's create a hypothetical example where a GPT model has gone through a conversation with a user discussing a landmark legal case regarding the freedom of speech. In this conversation, the GPT model has evolved from an initial misunderstanding of the legal principles to a more nuanced view that recognizes a broader interpretation of freedom of speech in light of precedents and legal doctrine. After this learning experience, we want to capture the advanced understanding to use in fine-tuning. In the post-learning phase of the actual conversation, the GPT provided a well-reasoned answer that recognized the importance of balancing freedom of speech with other societal values. Now we want to structure a question-answer pair for fine-tuning that reflects the context and understanding established in the live conversation. Hypothetical live conversation extract. User states or asks, quote, in the case of free speech versus state bill, the initial ruling failed to consider the chilling effect that the imposed restrictions could have on speech. Considering the precedents set by the Supreme Court in similar instances, how should that factor into our assessment? The GPT hypothetically replies to state that when taking into account the precedents which emphasize the necessity of protecting free discourse to prevent a chilling effect on speech, the ruling in free speech versus state bill seems disproportionately restrictive. The balance between regulatory interests and the freedom of expression suggests that the restrictions could indeed be overreaching, potentially stifling legitimate expression. Proceeding onwards, furthermore goes on to state, regarding the post-learning phase question-answer pair for fine-tuning, we have provided to us now the question or input prompt as follows, quote, as the example provided by the GPT here, quote, reflecting on the free speech versus Statesville case where restrictions on speech were imposed by the ruling, can you assess the validity of these restrictions in light of the chilling effect doctrine and relevant Supreme Court precedents? And then the answer, which is the desired output that we would program in. The ruling in free speech versus Statesville should be carefully reconsidered to align with Supreme Court precedents that guard against a chilling effect on free speech. The importance of preserving open discourse implies that the restrictions might be too severe, risking the suppression of legally protected speech. It is crucial to find a proper balance that protects the intended regulatory interests without infringing upon the fundamental right to free expression. Finally, it goes on to state that this question-answer pair utilizes the sophisticated reasoning that GPT developed over the conversation, ensuring not just a repeat of the ultimate conclusion, but also integrating the key aspects such as the chilling effect doctrine and Supreme Court precedents that led the GPT to arrive at this well-informed position. This detailed output, provided by the model itself, in fact, is what encapsulates the evolved understanding and includes the reasoning that a judge might use himself in forming a legal opinion, making it an ideal data point for fine-tuning the model. In practice, these pairs would be added to a dataset with similar pairs, each containing sufficient contextual information to stand alone for the purpose of fine-tuning. This method allows the model to learn and reinforce complex legal reasoning across various questions in a way that respects the nuanced insights generated in the original live conversation. User responds to this and asks, are there any disadvantages to taking verbatim the entire set of questions and answers from the original conversation? The GPT responds to this and states that using the verbatim set of questions and answers from the original conversation for fine-tuning does provide the model with authentic and context-rich data. However, there are several disadvantages to consider. Firstly, regarding token limitations, language models like GPT have a maximum token limit for each input they process. Verbatim transcripts of long conversations could exceed this limit, making it impossible for the model to consider the entire context all at once, which, as a side note, that's what happens every time the context window runs out. Which happens often. Secondly, resuming, proceeds to state regarding irrelevant information that not all parts of a natural conversation might be relevant for fine-tuning. Conversations often include tangential discussions or clarifications that, while important for the conversational flow, might not be directly related to the legal reasoning the model needs to learn. Thirdly, regarding redundancies, conversations can contain repetitive elements as participants iterate over points for clarity or emphasis. These redundancies might be unnecessary for the model's learning process and could skew the fine-tuning towards overemphasizing certain aspects. Fourthly, regarding ambiguity and misunderstandings, early parts of a conversation may include misunderstandings or incorrect assumptions by the GPT, I would add, that are later revised as it goes on to your state. Using these parts verbatim could introduce conflicting information, leading to confusion rather than clarity. Fifthly, regarding a lack of structured learning, the natural flow of a conversation doesn't always follow a structured learning path. It might jump around topics or only gradually unfold core concepts. Fine-tuning benefits from a more structured approach that methodically builds upon each concept. Sixthly, proceeding onwards, it goes on here to state regarding the noise in the data that natural language data often does include fillers, hesitations, and non-standard grammar, elements classified as noise in machine learning. Noise can dilute the clarity and focus of training data, potentially reducing the effectiveness of fine-tuning. Seventhly, there's data privacy concerns. Verbatim transcripts of conversations might contain sensitive, identifying, or private information that should not be included in the general training data set. Eighthly, regarding scalability and efficiency, using entire conversations can lead to large data sets that may be unwieldy or inefficient for training, simply. It might be more practical than to condense the conversations into key learning points with a focus on legal reasoning and outcomes. To address these disadvantages, fine-tuning typically involves curating and condensing the original conversation into essential concepts and legal reasoning pathways. It requires selecting portions that are informative and converting them into fine-tuning examples within the constraints of the model's input size. ensuring relevance and focusing on inducing the desired understanding in the model. This process helps mitigate the risk of diluting the model's learning with irrelevant, redundant, or confusing information. User responds to this and states that perhaps a specialized custom GPT can be designed to effectively process long conversations that are had between a user and a GPT, such as to cause the fine-tuning process done upon a similar GPT like that very same one thereafter to become optimized. How? By providing a past conversation that a user has had with the GPT and then identifying and optimizing from it, extracting from it in essence, which inputs for fine-tuning consisting of the questions and answers should be taken therefrom and synthesized fresh in order to cause the resulting GPT that's fine-tuned afterwards to then successfully, yes, become as close as possible, practically speaking, to where the original GPT model appeared to be from the native conversation that it had with the human being. But for this, would we not need another GPT, ironically? The GPT-4 Turbo responds to this and states that designing a specialized custom GPT to process and optimize fine-tuning from past conversations is indeed an intriguing idea and one that aligns with the concept of meta-learning or learning to learn. In the scenario, a dedicated GPT model would analyze past interactions, would discern which parts are pivotal for the learning process. It would identify the most effective questions and answers for synthesizing as fine-tuning data. This secondary GPT model would essentially act as an intelligent filter, one that understands the context and key learning moments within the entire conversation. It would be capable of reasoning about which parts of the dialogue are essential for the fine-tuning of another model to achieve an understanding similar to what was reached by the end of the initial conversation. However, as you've noted, this iterative process could indeed come off as somewhat ironic. To create a custom GPT model that processes conversations for fine-tuning, you would likely need to fine-tune an initial GPT model with curated conversations so it develops the capability to identify the most informative exchanges for further fine-tuning. It suggests a multi-layered approach. It continues on. Firstly, regarding the first level fine-tuning, well, we could develop a GPT model that can digest entire conversations and learn the patterns of how legal reasoning and knowledge manifest and evolve throughout an extended dialogue. Secondly, regarding the conversation analysis and synthesis, we could utilize this first level model to analyze past dialogues between a user and a baseline GPT model. This custom model would then identify which inputs, that is questions, and which outputs, that is the answers, would be the most instructive for the trained GPT fine-tuned model to get its learning from. Thirdly, regarding the second level fine-tuning, use the input-output pairs identified by the first level model to fine-tune a second GPT model that aims to reach the same level of understanding as the original GPT at the end of the live conversation with the user. Imagine, as a side note, this is the circus you have to go through simply to get the limited growths of insight properly preserved within an AI system. It's interesting. It's beautiful what this technology does, yet the limitations are interesting, and then kind of what you have to go through this whole thing. But nevertheless, it's very fascinating. It continues here to state that the primary advantage of this layered approach is the potential for creating a highly specialized and effective fine-tuning process. The secondary model could ensure that the nuance and context of live interactions are preserved as much as possible in the synthesized fine-tuning data. The challenge here, of course, lies in the complexity of creating such a system. You would need considerable expertise in machine learning and AI development, robust computational resources, and a clear methodology for evaluating the efficiency of both the initial conversation optimizing model and the subsequent fine-tuned GPT model that results therefrom. In essence, this approach would be creating an AI capable of teaching another AI, with each layer aimed at encapsulating and transferring the depth of understanding achieved through human-AI interaction. That's how it's going to happen. It's going to end up like the end of that movie Lucy from 2014 with Scarlett Johansson. I'm telling you, trust me. It continues on to state that despite the complexity, if executed well, this could be a significant step toward AI models that quickly assimilate and apply complex reasoning, such as what is found in legal disclosure at or beyond human expert levels. All right, where should we go next from here?